The dark clouds hung heavily over Pine Valley Funeral Home, their ominous presence reflecting the sorrow of the day. It was a Tuesday morning and the atmosphere was thick with the weight of loss. Inside the funeral home, the room was filled with mourners, a sea of faces dimmed by grief. Sarah Mitchell stood at the back of the room, her 16-year-old frame nearly concealed behind a large floral arrangement that did little to hide the storm brewing within her. The black dress she wore felt suffocating around her neck, the fabric constricting with each shallow breath she took. Her hands, clammy with nerves, trembled as they clutched the worn leather diary tucked inside her purse, a relic from her grandmother's life that now carried an unbearable truth. The funeral home's main hall was crowded, filled with more than 100 people. Some dabbed their eyes with tissues, their faces flushed with sorrow, while others whispered quietly, exchanging words of sympathy and recounting how wonderful a woman Eleanor Mitchell had been. The familiar scent of lilies, a fragrance that had always been Eleanor's favorite, lingered in the air, filling the room with a sweetness that made Sarah feel faint. The flower arrangements around her were lovely, but they only reminded her of how little they truly represented her grandmother's final months. Her heart tightened as she wondered if anyone here really knew the truth. Up at the podium, her father, Thomas Mitchell, stood tall, yet his usual confidence seemed to have evaporated. His voice wavered as he began the eulogy, and the sight of him so broken, so vulnerable, shook Sarah to her core. "My mother, Eleanor Mitchell, was more than just a parent," Thomas began, his voice trembling despite his attempt at control. "She was a beacon of light in our community." He paused, clearing his throat as he fidgeted with his black tie. Sarah couldn't help but notice how much older he seemed today, his face more worn with grief than it had ever been before. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his reading glasses, a familiar gesture, but one that felt foreign in this moment. From her position at the back, Sarah could see her Aunt Patricia in the front row, weeping uncontrollably into her husband's shoulder, her sobs punctuating the silence around her. Next to her sat Uncle Robert, his stern face set in stone, offering no emotion. Sarah's extended family filled the first few rows, cousins, second cousins, and elderly relatives she barely knew, each person offering their own tribute to the woman they thought they knew. Yet none of them truly understood the woman Eleanor had become in her final days. The weight of the knowledge Sarah carried pressed on her chest like a physical force. Her finger absently traced the outline of the diary in her purse, feeling the rough edges of the papers inside, the photocopies of documents that told a very different story about Eleanor's last days. The truth hung in the air, thick and suffocating, yet Sarah could not speak it. Her father's words felt like a betrayal, each one further burying her grandmother's true memory under layers of lies. The gap between what was being said and what Sarah knew was an abyss she could not cross, not yet. Her father continued, unaware of the storm raging in his daughter's mind. "Mom spent her final months in peaceful reflection at Sunny Grove Nursing Home," he said, his voice taking on a softer tone. "The staff there took such good care of her, treating her like family until her final moments." Sarah's jaw clenched, the words cutting deeper with each syllable. She could hear Jenny Thompson beside her, standing quietly as Sarah's best friend had since childhood, and feeling Jenny's soft hand squeeze hers in silent support. Jenny was the only one who knew what Sarah had discovered. Jenny was the only one who had helped her piece together the puzzle over the last 2 weeks, the disturbing pieces of the truth that had been buried so carefully by those who had failed to see the real Eleanor. 2 weeks earlier, Sarah's life had changed forever, a shift that began on a rainy Saturday afternoon as the task of clearing out her grandmother's house fell to the family. The Mitchells had come together to sift through the remnants of Eleanor's life, and Sarah, determined to hold on to every memory of the woman who had raised her, volunteered to tackle the attic. It was an old Victorian house, one that seemed to have swallowed up decades of memories and secrets. The attic was musty, filled with the scent of old wood and dust. The air was stifling, heavy with the memories of a life lived long ago, and Sarah's ponytail clung to her sweaty neck as she sifted through boxes and old furniture. She had been working for hours, sorting through Christmas decorations, flipping through yellowed photo albums, when something unusual caught her eye. A floorboard, slightly raised above the others, seemed out of place. Curiosity gnawed at her. She ran her fingers over the edge, feeling it shift under her touch. With the screwdriver she'd borrowed from her father's toolbox, she pried up the floorboard, revealing a dark, hidden space. Beneath the floor was a metal box, heavy and old, about the size of a thick textbook. Her breath quickened. Why had her grandmother, so open and honest throughout her life, hidden something away like this? "Sarah, how's it going up there?" Her father's voice floated up from downstairs, snapping her out of her trance. "I'm fine, Dad, just going through some old books," Sarah called back, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. She snapped a photo of the box on her phone, knowing she needed to find the key before showing anyone else. Something in her gut told her this was important, that it would explain things she hadn't understood about her grandmother's life in the past few months. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Sarah stayed behind to continue her work. She convinced her parents that she just wanted to finish organizing some boxes, and once they had left, she started her search in earnest. She combed through her grandmother's bedroom, checking every drawer, jewelry box, and possible hiding place. When she finally found the key hidden behind an old photograph in Eleanor's bedroom, her heart skipped a beat. The box and its contents had been waiting for her to uncover them, waiting to reveal the truth. The discovery of the box and its contents was only the beginning. Inside, Sarah found her grandmother's leather diary. At first, the entries were as expected: daily observations about life at Sunny Grove, notes about the other residents, the staff, and small anecdotes about gardening. But then, about 3 months into her stay, the tone of the entries changed. Eleanor's once light-hearted notes became darker, filled with fear and anxiety. The staff at Sunny Grove, once praised for their care and attention, were now painted in a much different light. Eleanor spoke of strange occurrences, unsettling whispers among the nurses, and mysterious happenings behind closed doors. And then, just one day before her death, Eleanor's final entry shook Sarah to her core. It spoke of gathering proof that something was terribly wrong at Sunny Grove, and that Eleanor intended to contact the authorities. But Eleanor never got the chance to expose the truth. The entry ended abruptly, and the next day, Eleanor was dead. As her father concluded the eulogy, Sarah felt the weight of the diary grow heavier in her purse, its truth pressing down on her. She knew the time had come for her to speak. The revelation she carried would change everything for her family, for Sunny Grove, and for the memory of her beloved grandmother. But how could she expose the truth when it would tear apart everything she thought she knew about the people in her life? As the minister stepped forward to begin the final prayers, Sarah felt the moment of truth fast approaching. "Certainly. Expanding this paragraph into 1,100 words, not 11,300 words, which seems like a typo, involves adding depth, dialogue, sensory details, and inner thoughts to enrich the narrative. Here's an expanded version." Hours passed, each minute stretching longer than the last, and Sarah began to lose hope. Her fingers, stiff from the cold of the attic, trembled as she sifted through the clutter. She'd gone through box after box, piece of furniture after piece of furniture, but nothing had turned up the key that could unlock the box hidden in the floorboard. Her head felt heavy, the weight of the day pressing down on her like the thick clouds outside. It had been 2 weeks since her grandmother's funeral, and Sarah hadn't been able to shake the feeling that there was something more to Eleanor's death than anyone was letting on. She thought of the diary she'd found, the last entries that spoke of something sinister happening at Sunny Grove Nursing Home, and how Eleanor had desperately tried to document everything before it was too late. Every time Sarah read those pages, she could almost hear her grandmother's voice, each word dripping with the same fear that Sarah now felt in the pit of her stomach. There had to be something more, something that would connect all of the dots. Something that would bring the truth to light. Just as she was about to give up, her eyes fell on something unusual. There, tucked behind the back of an old family photograph that hung crookedly on the wall, was a slight bulge. Her heart skipped a beat. With trembling hands, Sarah carefully reached up and removed the picture frame, the cold, smooth wood of the frame cool against her fingers. As the photograph came loose from the wall, she gasped. There, taped to the back of the frame, was a small silver key. It was as if the key had been waiting for her all along. Back in the attic, her heart pounded in her chest as she inserted the key into the lock of the metal box. It fit perfectly, and with a soft click, the box opened. Inside, Sarah found several folders, a small notebook, and most importantly her grandmother's diary, bound in worn brown leather. Her hands shook as she carefully pulled the diary free, but there was no time for hesitation. She needed to know the truth. The first few pages of Eleanor's diary were as expected. Mundane entries detailing her adjustment to Sunny Grove. She wrote about her new room, the other residents, the nurses who cared for her, and her daily routines. At first, everything seemed normal enough. The nurses were kind, the residents friendly. But Sarah's fingers itched to turn the pages, her eyes scanning each one with increasing urgency. There was a sense of unease building in her chest. The entries soon took a darker turn. Eleanor had begun to document things that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Something isn't right here," Eleanor had written 3 months before her death. "Mrs. Jenkins disappeared last night. They say she was transferred to the hospital, But her daughter wasn't notified until this morning, and her room was completely cleaned out before dawn. Sarah felt her stomach churn. She read the entry over and over, each word sinking deeper into her mind, until it felt like the words were branded into her thoughts. Mrs. Jenkins. Eleanor had been investigating the strange disappearances at Sunny Grove, and now Sarah knew she had to keep going. Jenny, Sarah muttered, pulling out her phone. Her heart raced as she dialed her best friend's number. It was the middle of the afternoon, but Sarah didn't care. She needed someone to help her make sense of what she was finding. "Jenny, I need you to come over right now," she said, her voice low and frantic. "And don't tell anyone where you're going." Half an hour later, Jenny arrived, her presence a small comfort in the otherwise eerie attic. The two girls sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by the scattered papers. Jenny's wide eyes scanned the diary entries, the weight of what they were uncovering sinking in. "This is seriously messed up," Jenny whispered, her voice barely audible. She glanced up at Sarah. "Your grandmother was investigating the nursing home. She knew something was wrong." Sarah nodded grimly, spreading out the contents of the folders. Medication charts, staff schedules, and handwritten notes were scattered before them, each piece of evidence like a breadcrumb leading to a horrifying truth. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a page dated just 2 weeks before Eleanor's death. 3 residents died in 1 week, all with similar symptoms. Grandma wrote that their medical records were changed after they died. Jenny, eyes wide, picked up another document, flipping through the pages. She looked up, her voice trembling. She was taking photos too. "These show different medications than what's listed in the official charts." Sarah felt a chill run through her. They had uncovered something no one was supposed to know. Her grandmother had been gathering evidence, risking everything to expose the truth. There was no turning back now. The two girls spent the rest of the night in the attic, meticulously organizing the evidence. They took notes, made copies of everything, and connected the dots on a large poster board, just like they'd seen detectives do in movies. Eleanor's final entries grew increasingly urgent, describing late-night meetings between staff members, strange behavior, and suspicious changes in resident care. "I have proof now," Sarah read aloud, her voice quiet but firm. "Read the last entry. It's dated the day before Eleanor died." She felt her heart pound faster as she spoke the words. "Tomorrow, I'm calling the authorities. I can't stay silent any longer. What they're doing here is criminal." Jenny's face went pale. "Your grandmother," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "She never got the chance to make that call, did she?" Sarah shook her head, the weight of her grandmother's death settling like a stone in her chest. "No," she whispered. "She died that night. And now I know why." The rain continued to pour outside the attic window, its sound steady and rhythmic, as if it too shared in their grief. Sarah placed the diary and copies of the documents into her backpack, her mind already racing with what needed to be done. The truth about Sunny Grove Nursing Home had died with her grandmother, but not for long. Sarah knew what she had to do. The upcoming funeral would bring everyone together, including those responsible for Eleanor's death. It would be the perfect time to reveal everything. The week following Sarah's discovery turned into a nightmare. Every night, after her parents thought she was asleep, Sarah stayed awake, reading through the diary entries over and over. The words haunted her, the chilling details of Eleanor's investigation making sleep impossible. Jenny came over every day after school, and the two girls worked tirelessly to piece together everything they had found. They spread out all the evidence across Sarah's bedroom floor, using sticky notes and string to connect the events on a large poster board, just like detectives they'd seen in crime shows. On Thursday night, Sarah pointed to their timeline, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look at this pattern. Every time a resident complained about the wrong medications, they either died or were suddenly transferred within a week." Jenny leaned closer, adjusting her glasses. "And all the deaths happened at night when that same nurse, Mrs. Henderson, was on duty," she added. The girls had created a detailed spreadsheet of all the information from Eleanor's diary. There were 12 suspicious deaths in just 4 months, all with similar patterns. Eleanor had even managed to take photos of medication labels that didn't match the prescriptions in patients' files. That night, as Sarah lay awake, she thought about her grandmother's courage. Eleanor had pretended to be confused and forgetful, but all the while, she had been gathering evidence. She had earned the staff's trust so completely that they didn't even notice her watching, documenting, and investigating. The next day, Sarah made a decision. She would go to Sunny Grove herself. She told her parents she wanted to collect her grandmother's remaining belongings, but that wasn't her real mission. Jenny would wait in the car across the street, ready to call Sarah's parents if anything went wrong. The nursing home was as sterile as Sarah remembered. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the smell of antiseptic filled the air, making her stomach churn. As she walked past the front desk, the receptionist barely glanced up from her phone. A few elderly residents sat in the common room, watching TV or playing cards, their faces tired and lifeless. "Sarah dear. How nice to see you." Mrs. Henderson's sugary voice made Sarah freeze. She turned slowly to face the head nurse, whose pink scrub stood out against the dull gray walls. Mrs. Henderson was smiling, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Are you here for your grandmother's things?" she asked, her voice sweet but cold. Sarah forced a smile, remembering what Eleanor had written about Mrs. Henderson's late-night activities. "Yes," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I'd also like to see her room one last time if that's okay." Mrs. Henderson's smile faltered for just a second. "Of course, sweetie. Though we've already cleaned it out for the next resident." Sarah followed Mrs. Henderson down the hallway, her eyes scanning every corner. She noted the security cameras just as her grandmother had described. Eleanor had mentioned that the cameras mysteriously stopped working on nights when residents died. As they entered Eleanor's old room, Sarah pretended to wipe away tears while she examined every detail. The window was just as her grandmother had described, a clear view of the parking lot. "Your grandmother was so happy here," Mrs. Henderson said, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder. The touch made Sarah's skin crawl. "She never complained about anything?" "No," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. She had to get out of there. But she knew, deep in her gut, that the truth was just beginning to unfold. That evening, Sarah and Jenny sat in Sarah's room, their focus sharp and their movements deliberate as they made their final preparations. The tension in the air was thick, like the weight of the impending storm. They had spent the last few days organizing the evidence they had uncovered, carefully categorizing everything into sections that were clear, concise, and easy to understand. Sarah had made 3 complete copies of everything. One set in a folder she kept hidden in her bedroom, another set tucked inside her backpack, and a third set mailed to Jenny's house for safekeeping. She couldn't risk anything being destroyed or lost. Not now. Jenny had been there with Sarah every step of the way. She had helped sort through the final batch of photographs, the last bits of evidence that would expose what had been happening at Sunny Grove. There was no going back now. "Are you sure you want to do this at the funeral?" Jenny asked, her voice quiet but laced with concern. She was folding a stack of photographs, her hands moving with practiced precision, though her eyes betrayed the anxiety she felt. "It's going to cause a huge scene." Sarah paused, her eyes lingering on the last photo of her grandmother, Eleanor. In the photograph, Eleanor was sitting in her nursing home room, a soft, brave smile on her face, though her eyes seemed to hold a secret. The smile seemed out of place now, given everything Sarah had discovered. How had they all thought her grandmother was just a confused old lady, when Eleanor had been documenting everything with such clarity and precision? "They thought she was just a confused old lady," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger as the words left her mouth. "They didn't expect her to be documenting everything. And now they think their secret died with her. But it didn't. I'm not going to let it." Jenny's eyes softened and she hugged her friend tightly, her voice full of admiration. "You're as brave as she was, you know that?" she whispered. Sarah squeezed her best friend back. Jenny had always been there for her, even when things got tough. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat but pushed it down. Now wasn't the time to be emotional. She had a mission to complete. Later that night, Sarah wrote her own diary entry, detailing everything she had learned over the past weeks. The discoveries in the attic, the diary entries, the suspicious deaths at Sunny Grove, the unmarked packages, and the changes to medical records. She sealed it in an envelope and handed it to Jenny for safekeeping. "Just in case," she said softly. "I need to make sure the truth gets out, no matter what happens tomorrow." Tomorrow was the funeral, and Sarah knew in her heart that she would need all the courage she could muster. The weight of her grandmother's legacy rested heavily on her shoulders, but she was determined to finish what Eleanor had started. She couldn't let the truth die with her grandmother. Not after everything they'd uncovered. As Sarah lay down to sleep, the quiet darkness enveloped her, but her mind was far from still. She whispered into the silence as though her grandmother might hear her, "I'll finish what you started, Grandma. I promise. They won't get away with this." The morning of the funeral was heavy with rain. The sky was dark as if the world itself was mourning. Sarah stood beside her father as he delivered the eulogy. She felt the weight of the words hanging in the air, a sadness creeping over her like a blanket, suffocating and unrelenting. Her hands were clammy as they gripped her grandmother's diary, but she couldn't bring herself to let go. Her heart pounded against her chest and she knew the time had come. It had to come. And so we say goodbye to a wonderful mother, grandmother, and friend. Her father's voice cracked with emotion as he spoke, his words heavy with grief. Who left us peacefully in her sleep at Sunny Grove, surrounded by caring staff who... No? Sarah's voice rang out sharply through the funeral home, her single word cutting through the air like a knife. It echoed off the walls, causing everyone in the room to turn and stare. She stepped forward from her position at the back of the room, her black shoes clicking softly against the wooden floor. The sudden silence felt suffocating. Mrs. Henderson, who had been sitting in the middle rows, straightened up, her sharp eyes narrowing as she took in Sarah's defiant posture. Dr. Phillips, the director of Sunny Grove, turned to watch Sarah, his expression shifting to one of concern, no, of suspicion. The other mourners were shocked, some with mouths agape, others with wide eyes, unsure of what was happening. Sarah Mitchell, sit down right now, her mother's voice hissed urgently from her seat, her face flushing crimson with embarrassment. This is not the time or place for this. But Sarah didn't sit down. She kept walking, her legs feeling like lead as she approached the front. She had to do this. Jenny, still at the back, held her breath as she watched her best friend approach the podium, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea how this would turn out, but she knew that Sarah had made up her mind. "I'm sorry, Dad," Sarah said, her voice shaking at first but growing stronger with each word. "But I can't let you finish that speech. Grandma didn't die peacefully, and Sunny Grove isn't what everyone thinks it is." Thomas Mitchell stepped back from the podium, his face a mixture of confusion and anger. He had been expecting a quiet funeral, not this. "Sarah, this isn't the time for—" "It's exactly the time and place," Sarah interrupted, pulling out Eleanor's diary. She clutched it tightly in her hands. Grandma wanted everyone to know the truth. She was murdered to keep her quiet. Gasps filled the room, the mourners looking at each other in disbelief. Aunt Patricia dropped her tissue to the floor, while Uncle Robert stood up, his face red with outrage. "Young lady, that's enough," he bellowed. Sarah opened the diary, her fingers trembling as she turned to the last entry her grandmother had written. "2 weeks ago, I found this in Grandma's attic." Listen to what she wrote. She cleared her throat and began to read aloud. "Tonight I saw them bringing in unmarked packages through the back door again. Mrs. Henderson changed Mr. Peterson's medication charts after he died, just like the others. I have all the evidence now, the photos, the real medical records, everything. Tomorrow morning I'm calling the police." Suddenly Mrs. Henderson stood up, her face twisted in disbelief and fury. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "That poor girl is clearly struggling with grief." She started moving toward the exit, but Jenny quickly stepped in front of the door, blocking her path. "The police are already on their way," Jenny announced loudly, her voice firm. "They've been watching Sunny Grove since we sent them copies of everything last week." Dr. Phillips jumped to his feet, his face turning red with anger. "This is absurd." Eleanor Mitchell was a confused old woman who was smart enough to document everything, Sarah cut in, pulling out a stack of papers from her bag. 12 deaths in 4 months, all during Mrs. Henderson's night shifts, all with changed medical records. Grandma took pictures of everything. The room erupted into chaos. Some people were crying, others shouting, but the air was thick with disbelief. Sarah's father grabbed the papers from her with trembling hands, his face draining of color as he scanned the documents. "My mother," he whispered in horror, "my mother tried to tell me something was wrong. I thought she was just having trouble adjusting." Just then the sound of sirens filled the air. Police cars were pulling up outside the funeral home, their sirens wailing as they stopped in front. Mrs. Henderson made one last attempt to escape, but she was blocked by 2 of Sarah's cousins who worked as security guards. They locked her path and the officers quickly entered the room. Sarah's heart was racing as she stepped back, watching as the police led Mrs. Henderson and Dr. Phillips away in handcuffs. They already had warrants, not just for arrests but to seize all the records at Sunny Grove. The room fell silent as everyone watched the officers work, and Sarah finally let her tears fall. She placed her grandmother's diary gently beside the casket, her voice breaking as she whispered, "I did it, Grandma. I kept my promise." Thomas Mitchell wrapped his arms around his daughter, his own tears flowing freely. "Your grandmother," he said softly, "would be so proud of you." The funeral had turned into something far more significant than anyone had anticipated. It was no longer just a goodbye, it was the beginning of justice. For the next 2 hours, the funeral home was a scene of controlled chaos. Police officers moved efficiently through the crowd, taking statements from stunned family members, while crime scene investigators carefully collected Eleanor's diary and all the evidence Sarah had brought. Detective Maria Rodriguez, a seasoned officer with kind eyes but a firm expression, sat with Sarah and Jenny, listening intently as they recounted everything they had learned. The Mitchell family sat in a small, private room off the main hall of the funeral home. The muffled sounds of confused and angry voices drifted in from the main area, but inside the room, there was a sense of controlled chaos. Detective Maria Rodriguez, a seasoned investigator with kind eyes but a firm expression, sat at the small table, her laptop open in front of her. She was showing Sarah and her parents' surveillance photos from the nursing home, evidence that confirmed the disturbing truth Sarah had uncovered. The photos displayed nighttime activities at Sunny Grove Nursing Home, activities that were far from innocent. The truth was finally out, but the weight of the information was only starting to hit the Mitchells. Sarah's mother, Karen, hadn't stopped crying since the moment the shocking revelation had been made. She clutched her husband's hand tightly, her tears staining the sleeves of his shirt. "I can't believe we put Eleanor in that place," Karen sobbed, her voice breaking with grief. "We thought we were doing the best for her. We trusted them." Her voice wavered as the guilt washed over her, the crushing realization that their decision had unknowingly placed Eleanor in the hands of those who would harm her. Sarah's father, Thomas Mitchell, sat beside her, his face pale and stricken with shock. He held some of the papers Sarah had brought with her, the same papers that had led to the investigation, his fingers trembling slightly as he read through them. The truth had hit him hard. His mother, Eleanor, had been right all along and he hadn't seen it. It had taken her death to bring the truth to light, and the toll of that knowledge had aged him years in just a matter of hours. His face looked older, more drawn, as if the burden of this realization had stolen a part of him. "Dad," Sarah said softly, her voice barely above a whisper as she touched his arm. "Grandma wrote about trying to tell you. She knew you were busy with work and whenever you visited they made her seem confused. But she wasn't. She was trying to tell you the truth." Thomas didn't respond immediately, his eyes still focused on the papers. His brow furrowed in thought, a mix of regret and disbelief on his face. He had been so sure that Sunny Grove was a safe place for his mother, so certain that the staff there were trustworthy. Now everything he had believed seemed like a lie. Outside the room, Sarah could hear Jenny giving her statement to another officer. Jenny had been a rock for Sarah throughout this entire ordeal, helping her sort through the evidence, keeping copies of everything and even mailing one set to her own house. For safekeeping. Sarah's thoughts were momentarily distracted by the sound of the sirens outside, signaling the arrival of the news vans. The story was getting out. The press was already picking up on the scandal and soon, more people would know what had been happening at Sunny Grove. Detective Rodriguez spoke again, her voice firm but reassuring. "You did the right thing coming to us last week with copies of everything," she said, looking at Sarah with a deep sense of respect. "It gave us time to start our investigation quietly, without alerting anyone to our activities. It was crucial that we had that head start." Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and sorrow. Her grandmother's bravery had led to this moment. The truth was finally out, but the fight was far from over. Detective Rodriguez clicked open a folder on her laptop and began showing them the results of the investigation. "We've already raided Sunny Grove," she said, her tone calm but serious. "Based on your grandmother's evidence, our investigation is uncovering exactly what she documented. Falsified medical records, unauthorized medications, and evidence of systematic elder abuse. The scale of what's been happening is shocking." Sarah's phone buzzed incessantly with messages from relatives. Some were angry about the disruption at the funeral, while others were in shock over the revelations that had come to light. Aunt Patricia, overcome with emotion, had fainted at the funeral and was being treated by paramedics. Uncle Robert was outside, giving an emotional interview to reporters, his voice quivering with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "There's something else you should know," Detective Rodriguez added, her voice taking on a more serious tone. She reached into her bag and pulled out another folder, setting it on the table between them. "After Sarah contacted us, we were able to connect Eleanor's evidence to similar complaints from 3 other nursing homes owned by the same company, Care First Holdings. This is much bigger than just Sunny Grove. It's a criminal network. We're finding the same pattern of abuse at each of these facilities." The weight of this new information hit Sarah hard. Her grandmother hadn't just uncovered the crimes of one facility. Eleanor had been instrumental in exposing a vast criminal enterprise that had been operating under the radar for years. The thought of how brave her grandmother had been, quietly collecting evidence while pretending to be a helpless old woman, brought tears to Sarah's eyes. She couldn't believe the strength it had taken to endure that kind of abuse while still gathering the evidence that would ultimately bring it all to light. A young officer knocked gently on the door and entered the room. "Detective, we've finished processing the main hall," he said. "The family can proceed with the funeral if they wish." He paused before adding, "Ma'am, there are several other families from Sunny Grove outside. They want to speak with Sarah." Karen wiped her eyes, glancing at Sarah with uncertainty. "Maybe we should postpone the rest of the service," she suggested, her voice trembling. "We could meet with these families another time." But Sarah shook her head, her resolve firm. "No, Mom. Grandma deserves to be honored today. More than ever. She was a hero." Detective Rodriguez stood up, gathering her papers. "We'll need all of you to come to the station tomorrow for formal statements," she said. "But for now, take the time you need to be with your family. Officers will remain outside to ensure everyone's safety." As the detective left the room, Sarah made her way back to the main hall. She was surprised to see Jenny waiting for her just inside the door. Without a word, the two girls embraced tightly. Jenny was the first to speak, her voice filled with awe and disbelief. "I can't believe we really did it," she whispered, her words filled with wonder. The funeral home staff moved quickly and respectfully to rearrange the room, clearing away the chaos that had ensued in the wake of the revelation. Gradually, people began returning to their seats. The atmosphere had completely changed. Where there had been simple grief before, there was now a mixture of shock, anger, and pride. People were still processing what had happened, but there was a palpable shift in the room. The truth had come to light, and the family's pain was now joined by a sense of justice, however incomplete it still was. Thomas Mitchell returned to the podium, his hands steadier now, though his eyes were still red from tears. He cleared his throat before speaking. "I'd like to start my eulogy again," he announced, his voice stronger now, filled with a new kind of resolve. "Because I didn't truly know my mother until today. Eleanor Mitchell wasn't just a loving parent and grandparent. She was a warrior for justice who gave her life to protect others." Sarah sat between her mother and Jenny in the front row, holding both their hands tightly. Through the windows she could see more people gathering outside, families of other Sunny Grove residents, reporters, and police officers. The truth had finally come out, just as Eleanor had wanted. But Sarah knew that this was only the beginning. The real fight for justice was just starting, and she was ready to see it through. For her grandmother. For all the others who couldn't speak for themselves. The days following Eleanor Mitchell's funeral were a whirlwind of activity that no one in the family had expected. The Mitchells' living room had turned into an unofficial headquarters for the expanding investigation, with Detective Rodriguez making daily visits to gather more information. Sarah sat on the couch, watching the morning news with her parents. A headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen. "Sunny Grove Scandal, 37 Families Come Forward." The news anchor's voice filled the room. "In a shocking development, police have arrested 6 more staff members from Sunny Grove Nursing Home. Head nurse Clara Henderson and director James Phillips remain in custody, refusing to cooperate with investigators." The doorbell rang, interrupting the broadcast. Thomas Mitchell opened the door to find Mrs. Watson, whose husband had died at Sunny Grove 3 months ago. Her eyes were red from crying, and her hands trembled as she clutched an envelope. "I had to come," she said, her voice thick with grief. "George, my husband, he tried to tell me something was wrong with his medications. I didn't believe him. I thought he was just confused." Sarah moved to the door, remembering her grandmother's diary entries about Mr. Watson. Eleanor had written about his sudden decline after complaining about feeling strange after taking his evening medications. "Please come in," Sarah said softly, leading Mrs. Watson to the couch. More families had been visiting every day, each one sharing similar stories, each one feeling like another piece of the puzzle Eleanor had worked so hard to solve. Jenny arrived shortly after, carrying a stack of newspapers. She spread them out on the coffee table. "Look at this," she said, her voice filled with awe. 3 other nursing homes owned by CareFirst Holdings have been shut down. For investigation. Sarah's mother brought coffee and tissues for Mrs. Watson, who was now sharing photos of her late husband. The full scale of the injustice was becoming clearer by the day, and Sarah knew that their fight had only just begun. 6 months after Eleanor Mitchell's funeral, Sarah stood before her grandmother's grave, gazing down at the fresh flowers she had placed beside the newly engraved headstone. The morning sun bathed the cemetery in a soft, warm glow, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of nearby trees. The headstone now carried more than just her grandmother's name and dates. It had been updated with words that encapsulated the legacy Eleanor had left behind. Beloved mother and grandmother, a hero who fought for justice. The change had been approved only a week before, following the final verdicts in the long-awaited trial. As Sarah stood in quiet reflection, she wasn't alone. Her parents, Jenny, Detective Rodriguez, and dozens of other families from Sunny Grove were there with her. Each person was holding a flower, some also carrying framed photos of their loved ones, victims of the horrors that had taken place within the walls of the nursing home. Today was a special memorial service, not just for Eleanor, but for all the victims who had suffered because of the greedy and corrupt nursing home system that Eleanor had bravely exposed. Thomas Mitchell, Sarah's father, stood tall in front of the gathered crowd, his voice carrying through the cool morning air. Mrs. Henderson will serve 30 years in prison. Dr. Phillips testified against the company owners, and now they're all facing life sentences, he said, his words steady and full of conviction. Sarah felt a surge of pride as she recalled the final day of the trial. Mrs. Henderson, the former head nurse of Sunny Grove, had finally broken down and confessed to the entire scheme. She revealed how they had targeted elderly residents with few visitors, falsified medical records, and administered unauthorized medications to those who were vulnerable. She admitted how they had tried to silence Eleanor when she began uncovering their crimes. But Eleanor had persevered, documenting everything meticulously in her diary, and now, thanks to her bravery, the truth had been exposed. Jenny, standing beside Sarah, had been the one to document the entire case for her now famous series of articles. The stories had been picked up by national media outlets, and Jenny had been awarded a Young Journalist Award for her coverage. Today, however, she wasn't taking notes. This day wasn't about the story, it was about remembrance, closure, and honoring the people who had lost their lives because of an institution that should have cared for them. Care First Holdings has been shut down, Detective Rodriguez announced to the crowd, her voice resolute. All their properties have been seized, and the funds from the seizures will be distributed to the families of the victims. The audience nodded, some wiping away tears as the weight of the news settled in. But there was more good news to come. More importantly, Rodriguez continued, new laws are being passed. Eleanor's law will require stricter oversight of nursing homes across the country to ensure that this kind of abuse never happens again. As Detective Rodriguez spoke, Sarah watched Mrs. Watson step forward, holding a large framed photo of her late husband. Mrs. Watson had been one of the many families who had suffered because of Sunny Grove's practices. Because of Eleanor and Sarah, Mrs. Watson said, wiping tears from her eyes, we finally know the truth about what happened to our loved ones. We finally have peace. Sarah felt a lump in her throat. She had worked so hard to help her grandmother's story be heard, but hearing this kind of acknowledgement from the family she had helped gave her a sense of closure she hadn't expected. Other families shared their own stories, recounting how the case had helped them find peace or inspired them to continue fighting for change. Uncle Robert, who had become a passionate advocate for nursing home reform, had started a new advocacy group dedicated to improving care for the elderly. Aunt Patricia, a local lawmaker, was working with other officials to create stronger protections for nursing home residents. Even some of the younger nurses who had testified during the trial were now helping to create better training programs for healthcare workers, ensuring that what happened at Sunny Grove would never be allowed to happen again. Eleanor started something remarkable, Detective Rodriguez said quietly to Sarah, her voice full of respect. Investigations are happening nationwide. Dozens of corrupt facilities have been exposed, and thousands of elderly residents are safer now because of what she did. Sarah's heart swelled with pride as she thought about the magnitude of what had been achieved. Her grandmother had started a ripple that had turned into a wave, one that was making real change and protecting the most vulnerable members of society. Thomas Mitchell, Sarah's father, placed his arm around her shoulders and spoke softly. Mom would be so proud of how you carried on her fight, he said. You were just as brave as she was. Sarah smiled faintly, but the weight of his words pressed heavily on her chest. She had been terrified when she stood up at her grandmother's funeral to speak the truth. But now, 6 months later, she realized that the decision to confront the injustice had changed countless lives, including her own. Jenny, who had been Sarah's constant support throughout the ordeal, showed Sarah a copy of the article she had written for the national newspaper. The headline read Eleanor Mitchell's Legacy, The Fight for Nursing Home Reform. The article featured a beautiful photo of Eleanor and detailed the full impact of the case, from the exposure of Care First Holdings' criminal activity to the new legislation being introduced in multiple states to protect elderly residents. Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing that her grandmother's fight was continuing through Jenny's words, reaching even more people and inspiring them to take action. The families who had gathered around Eleanor's grave began placing their flowers around it, creating a beautiful garden of remembrance. Each person had a story to share, a memory to honor. Sarah called out to Mrs. Watson, "We have something to show you." Together with several other families, they unveiled a plaque that would be placed at the entrance of what had once been Sunny Grove. The building was being converted into a community center for seniors, complete with strict oversight and new programs designed to prevent abuse. The plaque read the Eleanor Mitchell Memorial Center, where every life is valued and protected. Beneath the words, a quote from Eleanor's diary was etched. "The truth, no matter how hard, must be spoken for those who cannot speak for themselves." As the memorial service concluded, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. The case that had started with her interrupting her grandmother's funeral had grown into a nationwide movement. It was a movement that would continue to protect vulnerable lives and give a voice to those who needed it most. Sarah knew that the fight wasn't over. There would always be more work to do, more battles to win, but today was a moment to honor her grandmother's legacy. "Ready to go?" Thomas asked gently. They had another meeting that afternoon, this time with state legislators who were seeking input on new nursing home regulations. Sarah nodded and took one last look at the flower-covered grave. "Yes," she said firmly. "Gran taught us that the fight for justice never really ends. There's always more work to do." As they walked away from the cemetery, the morning sun glinted off the words on Eleanor's headstone, making them shine brightly. Sarah knew her grandmother's final case had closed, but her legacy would live on, continuing to protect the vulnerable and fight for those who couldn't speak for themselves.